Get this, apparently Aggro's controls were made this way on purpose to make it seem more realistic. Oh yeah? Well, I play games for more than art, and realism should never come at the expense of good gameplay design choices.
Okay, Quarter Guy, I'm going to try to say this nicely, but frankly, this right here is where you jumped the shark. The whole complaining about realism. Here's the thing. You seem to think that good game design choices and realism are divorced from each other simply because good game design choices are game design choices you personally prefer. And since you do not prefer realism, even though this game's hardly realistic, I would use more the term authentic, but that's another argument from a different time. You seem to think it's flawed, when in actuality, it's not that the game makers made a mistake, they simply made a game that you don't like, and you're in essence judging the game for what you want it to be rather than for what it is. You're basically comparing apples to oranges, complaining about a romantic comedy film for, quite frankly, being a romantic comedy film. So when you say that you play games for more than just art and realism and that gets in the way of gameplay, you're kind of sounding like a narrow-minded, pretentious person. I don't think that's how you are, but that's kind of how you come across. Now, if you don't like this, I understand that, but I'm a bit surprised about, since you heard it from so many people, you must have seen footage of it, and you must have been wondering why people were praising it so much. So I'm not so much upset that you're disappointed into it, but I'm kind of wondering in my head, well, what were you expecting? I would think you would be able to tell, watching from footage and just hearing people's descriptions of it, that this is the kind of game that you wouldn't necessarily like.
Oh, and those boss fights? I lost interest after the first one. I'll admit it looked cool, but it was frustrating to get on the guy.
In other words, fuck this, give me Monster Hunter any day.
Okay, the whole frustrating thing to get on there, that's kind of the idea. As Wanda, you're not some super cool, over-the-top, demon hack-and-slash person, or some suggestive, over-the-top witch that causes arguments about feminism. You're very much a normal, not super enhanced, everyday person that's just trying to save his sister. The battles are supposed to make you feel powerless and small, like the only reason these things aren't curb stomping you and wiping your remains off the face of the earth is they see you more as a itch or a burden than an actual threat. Thus, they don't usually put up much of a fight. The overwhelming scope of it is what sells the game, and it's the exact same reason people love it. In other words, the same reason you hate the game was not only why other people love the game, but the point. Meaning, you're confusing your subjective personal preferences with objective judging of how game design works. And that whole Monster Hunter thing, Monster Hunter Shadow Colossus, just because on Monster Hunter 4 you can climb on monsters and Shadow Colossus you can too, they're still completely different games. It's once again like comparing apples to oranges. No, apples to tomatoes because they're both technically fruit and share those characteristics. Monster Hunter 4 and Shadow of the Colossus, you might be able to climb on giant monsters, but you climb on them different ways, and that's where the similarities end. So it's not really fair to compare your dislike for Shadow of the Colossus for the superiority of Monster Hunter 4.
The main villain for most of the game, Xande, is a worse villain than even X-Death. Let's see, the first game had a corrupted knight that became a demon lord, the second game had an emperor who conquered both heaven and hell, and what did this game give us? A wizard who wanted to live forever. Friggin' really?
There's something a bit off about your reasoning. It's similar to the Shadow of the Colossus one, but not quite as bad. For one, comparing this villain to the previous two villains, you seem to be saying the previous two villains are better for more of their over-the-top, like super mega overlord evil accomplishments. Basically, 12-year-old Dragon Ball Z style logic, where more powerful, more bigger, more badder, but not necessarily more fleshed out and complex, means the better villain. Now, admittingly enough, the villain in Final Fantasy III wasn't very well done, but the concept of him wanting to be immortal itself isn't what made it bad. It was the execution. I think in this game they're going for a bit more of a personal, down-to-earth, more human villain than the over-the-top evil bad guy you feel good about conquering in a heroic power fantasy. I'll leave a link down below contrasting the two villains and how they're often used in video games. Feel free to give it a check.
But the worst part is the job system. I like how you can choose from a lot of different classes. What I hate is the fact that whenever you change classes, your stats get nerfed until you get used to the change in class.
That's like if you swap out a Pokemon from your team for a new one, but the new one had slow start until you fought a few battles with it. How much sense does that make?
It's not really that good of a comparison you're making with the Pokemon. You see, with the Pokemon switching, that wouldn't make sense because they're completely different Pokemon. Not the same person, not just changing costumes, but literally learning a new skill and a new job. You know how in real life, when you're learning something new for the first time, you gotta get used to it until you learn the ropes? Oh yeah, that's right. Realism is the antichrist of gaming. I forgot. Well, forgive the developers for trying to put a little bit of authenticity into the game, although I admit if you are looking for a bit more of a traditional role-playing experience, that can be a bit irritating.
The plot is a shadow of former games, boiling down to a squabble between the Maverick Hunters and rival gang Red Alert over one of the latter's expats. I mean, we're going from fate of the world business to friggin' gang wars. Are you fucking serious? X? Dear God, they made X such a pussy-ass bitch that you can't even play as him when the game starts.
Why would you unlock a central feature of the game? That never works! Remember this?
In order to unlock X, you need to rescue Reploids, and that's a mess, because they're in places where they're likely to die if you're not pixel perfect. They die in one hit, and if they die, they're gone for good. It's a Killjoy in Fire Emblem games pre-Awakening, and it's a Killjoy here too.
Okay, there are a few things I have wrong with this. First of all, I can understand your disappointment with the sudden change in plot, but once again, you seem to think that good stories are ones with bigger stakes in saving the world, and you seem to think more personal, down-to-earth type aesthetics are inferior when it's not necessarily the case. Another thing is the whole secret of mana thing. Just because the Autark and Josh say that unlocking a central feature of the game, which I never really considered co-op a central feature of the game, just kind of a fun little bonus. Just because they say it doesn't mean it's fact, so I don't really accept that whole remember this example you did on Secret of Mana. It made perfect sense why the co-op wasn't unlocked later, because you needed to meet the party members to co-op. It's not like New Super Mario Brothers where there's a lot of game mechanics over story. That's what happens when you try to meet new adventurers on an RPG, and when you start out as one and, you know, and try to implement that in the story and have co-op. It's kind of different, and you could argue that it either doesn't work or you need to be expecting something else. As for the whole Killjoy thing, well, I admit it's a bit of a weird choice in the Mega Man X game you were talking about, since it's an achievement type thing where you needed to unlock a specific thing like the central character. Comparing it to Fire Emblem, I think it's a bit unfair, since on Fire Emblem, the whole it not feeling good when someone dies, that's kind of the idea. Another thing is, pre-Awakening, even if you lost a character, you could restart the chapter over again. It's pretty much the same as in casual mode, only the difference is you can try the level again, and the character that died won't waste all that XP, because on casual mode of Awakening, if a character did indeed die, then any experience they got, not only did they not get even if they come back in the next chapter, but they also stole experience another character had gotten. Whereas you just restart the chapters like in regular mode of any Fire Emblem game, you have a chance to either have that character get that XP by winning, or swap them out for a character you're actually good at least for that stage. And so, in general, you seem to be confusing arcade mentality or the standard for what should be good game design. Not that Mega Man X that game was necessarily good, but yeah, you get the idea.
The two-character system doesn't work well either, since you lose a life if either of your hunters goes down, because obviously their lives are intertwined somehow.
Quarter Guy, I find it a bit hypocritical that you're pointing out the flawed logic in how this game mechanic of the two lives being intertwined doesn't fit with, if one person dies, all the other people have to actually die, considering you seem to call such other examples out as realism, like your aforementioned Final Fantasy III example when you were people learning new things and having to adjust to them. That's BS, because that's the same thing as swapping two entirely different Pokemon and them having different stats, which it's not. Just seems a bit of a double standard to me, is all I'm saying.
Now, I really enjoyed the Samurai Showdown games in 2D. Fast-paced, hard-hitting, weapon-based combat that gave one big fuck you to any sense of realism.
This point right here is where I'm going to end my critique, because with this one statement right here, it kind of sums up a lot of what I've been noticing and some reoccurring themes in your criticisms of games. You seem to think that games that have a arcade obstacle course with an aesthetic of high stakes, end of the world, over the top powerful villain that you feel good about fighting are the standard of what a good game is, and anything that doesn't fit that standard is bad. Which, instead of that, I would say that it's more of a different type of game as opposed to a bad game. Kind of like you can't really compare certain genres of films with another, because if you go into a sci-fi expecting a fantasy, then you're going to be disappointed. And I can understand that presentation execution also has a huge part to do with it, like that Samurai Shogun game you were talking about. I kind of agree that it was a bit of a weird version of the series from the old games, even though I'd argue even the older games as far as 2D fighters go weren't that flashy and over the top and unrealistic, and had more focus on defense breaking and waiting to strike as opposed to combos. But more or less I kind of agree with you on that point. As my closing words, so keep in mind in the future that when trying a certain game and hearing how great it is, like Shadow of the Colossus, try to figure out exactly why people gush about it so much, and then you can be in the right mindset to play the game, where even if you don't necessarily like it, you won't be shocked and why other people like it, because frankly it seemed like you went into Shadow of the Colossus not expecting what to think of it, and all of your complaints you were saying about it, I was almost kind of thinking, well, duh. And the one last thing, in case you're wondering what inspired me to make this video series and why this video in particular is part of it, here's why. In the Chaos Theater, I think you're currently one of the most influential countdown artists. So anything you say, for better or for worse, your fans are going to say almost mindlessly. As much as I don't like it, people seem to look to you as an authority rather than necessarily forming their own opinion. So if you get a few things mixed up, other people do. And I kind of felt like I needed to get to the root of certain misconceptions. No offense. You have a lot of heart, Quarter Guy, but sometimes you have a tendency to leave your head behind. That being said, I do enjoy your countdowns, and most of the time I also enjoy your humor. And despite other people seeming to copy your preferences themselves are fairly unique for a countdown artist, having a more arcade-like preferences and mentality. I don't see much lists about top 10 2D shooters. That actually was a treat. But keep in mind that when you're celebrating what you like, to not bash on things you don't like simply because they're not your thing.